Okay, without much further ado, let's go into Chapter 5, Tissue Organization. Okay, so what are tissues? Tissues are groups of similar cells and extracellular material working together to perform a common function. There's 4 major types of tissues. There's epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue, and these differ in their structure, their function, and the composition of the extracellular matrix. Now, the extracellular matrix is that extracellular material that we mentioned earlier. So it's composed of proteins, water, and dissolved molecules, and consistency ranges from fluid, like in blood, to solid, like in bone. So the first tissue we're going to talk about is epithelium. This is epithelial tissue. It's composed of 1 or more layers of closely packed cells that contain little or no extracellular matrix. The epithelium covers body surfaces. So your skin would be an example of an epithelium. The lining of your gastrointestinal tract would be an epithelium, and it lines body cavities. So remember those serous membranes we learned about, the visceral and the parietal layers? Those are epithelia. And epithelia form the majority of the body's glands. Common characteristics of epithelial tissue. So all epithelial tissue is attached to a basement membrane. And this is a barrier between the epithelium and the underlying connective tissue. Epithelial tissue is avascular, so meaning all epithelial tissues lack blood vessels. Nutrients instead are obtained across the apical surface, so that would be the surface that's farthest from the basement membrane, or from the basal surface, and that's the surface that's attached to the basement membrane. They have extensive innervation to detect changes in their environment. And they have a high regeneration capacity. They undergo frequent cell division, and this is because epithelia are exposed directly to the environment around us. So there's going to be continual replacement of lost cells, cell division of stem cells. Okay, so here's an image of an epithelium. So here are the cells. These look kind of columnar, and we'll talk about what that means here in a little bit. But you can see this is the apical surface, or the surface facing the environment. And this is the basal surface of the cells, and this area is attached to the basement membrane, which is here. And then underneath the basement membrane is the layer of connective tissue, and it's the connective tissue that contains the blood vessels, because epithelia are avascular. So this is a section of epithelium viewed under the microscope. It's stratified epithelium, meaning that there are layers of cells on top of each other. Down here you have the stem cells, so this is the bottom part of the epithelium. And you would have the basement membrane. You can't really see it here, but it runs along this bottom part of these cells. Okay, and every one of these bottom cells, their basal surface is attached to the basement membrane. So these will be your stem cells that are constantly dividing and replacing these cells, because as they migrate out from the basal area, they will get damaged from the environment up here. This is where these cells come into contact with the environment. So you constantly need to replace these cells up here, and you do so with these stem cells down here. Now below the basement membrane, all of this is connective tissue, and we'll talk about that separately. So the functions of the epithelial tissue include physical protection, right? So this is going to protect you from the outside environment, protects you from dehydration, abrasion, and destruction. It serves as a selectively permeable barrier, so it's non-permeable to some substances and allows other substances to pass. Epithelial tissues can secrete, so some cells are specialized to secrete, and these are called glands. They can be scattered among other cell types or arranged into small organized clusters. Sensations. Epithelia contain nerve endings to detect sensations, and they supply information to the nervous system. So it gives us information on touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. Now, how do we classify epithelia? Well, you can classify either by the number of layers there are. So in simple epithelium, there's only one layer of cells, whereas in stratified epithelium, which we saw a minute ago in that microscope slide, there are several layers of cells. And we also classify based on the shapes of the cells on the top layer, okay? So they can be squamous, which is kind of this flat disc-like cell. They can be cuboidal, where they're about as tall as they are wide. And they can be columnar, where they're taller than they are wide. Okay, looking at this chart, there are a few divisions to be aware of. So the first division is between simple epithelium, which involves one layer of cells, and stratified epithelium, which involves two or more layers of cells. The second division is down here in under simple epithelium. You have simple columnar and pseudostratified columnar, and you'll notice this asterisk here means that there can be ciliated and non-ciliated types. So for the ciliated cells, the apical portion of the cell contains cilia. And then going over here, the third division would be under stratified epithelium, stratified squamous. You can have keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, so that would be like the epithelium of your skin, or you could have non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and an example of this would be like in the esophagus. Okay, first let's talk about simple squamous epithelium. This is when there's a single layer of flat cells, right? So squamous meaning flat, and the simple epithelium meaning there's a single layer of cells. These cells have a spherical to oval nucleus. This is an example of the thinnest barrier that you're going to see in the body. Its functions include diffusion, secretion, and absorption. And location, these epithelia, the simple squamous epithelia, line the air sacs of the lungs, or these are called the alveoli. And it lines blood and lymph vessel walls. When it does this, it's called endothelium. And it's not mentioned here, but it also makes up the mesothelium, which is that lining of serous membranes that covers your body cavities, right? Remember the parietal layer and the visceral layers? That's of the mesothelium, and that's a simple squamous epithelium. Next is simple cuboidal epithelium. So this is going to be a single layer of uniformly shaped cells that are about as tall as they are wide. So you can see here it's kind of square shaped. They're going to have a centrally located spherical nucleus. And the function of simple cuboidal epithelium is absorption and secretion, and also the formation of glands and ducts. So you're going to see this in the thyroid gland, on the surface of the ovary, in the walls of kidney tubules, and in secretory regions and ducts of most glands. Simple columnar epithelium, again, this is a single layer of cells because we're talking about a simple epithelium. These cells are kind of shaped like a column, and you can see the nucleus here is oval, and it's kind of located down in the basal region. So this, if you were to look at these cells, here's the basement membrane here where the arrows are pointing. Then you've got the cells here, and they're columnar shaped. And you've got the basal portion, which is the area that's closer to the basement membrane. And you have the apical portion, which is the area that's farthest from the membrane. And these function in absorption and secretion, and there's two forms to be familiar with, the non-ciliated and ciliated. And finally, you have pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So pseudostratified, right? Meaning falsely stratified. So it appears like there's multiple cell layers, but there is actually just one single cell layer. All the cells are in direct contact with the basement membrane, but not all the cells reach the apical surface, and you'll see nuclei scattered at different distances throughout the cell layer. And there's two forms. There's the ciliated form, which is going to be found in the respiratory tract, and then there's the non-ciliated form, which is very rare. It's found only in the male urethra and part of the male urethra and the epididymis. Okay, so let's move on to the stratified epithelia. So starting with stratified squamous epithelium. So there's going to be several layers of cells. You can see all the layers here. And only the deepest layer of cells is going to come in contact with the basement membrane. It's the apical cells that give the epithelium its name. So the apical cells are a squamous shape. And stratified squamous epithelium protects against abrasion and friction. And there are two types to be familiar with. There's the keratinized versus the non-keratinized type. So in the keratinized type, the outermost cells die and are filled with keratin. So an example of this would be the epidermis of the skin. And then in the non-keratinized form, the outermost cells are alive. And this serves as protection as well. And examples would be the vaginal canal, the upper third of the esophagus, the rectum, and the oral cavity, okay? So be familiar with two different types, the keratinized and the non-keratinized. And then how are these cells being replaced since they're dead up here? Well, stem cells in the basal layer are continuously dividing, and this replaces the lost cells at the surface. Next is stratified cuboidal epithelium. So again, this is two or more layers of cells because it's stratified. The cells at the apical surface are cube-shaped. And functions, again, you're going to see this over and over with epithelium, protection and secretion. So stratified cuboidal epithelium forms the walls of ducts in most exocrine glands. So these would be your sweat glands. Exocrine would also be in the pancreas. Stratified cuboidal epithelium also forms parts of the male urethra and the periphery of ovarian follicles. Now, stratified columnar epithelium is rare. Again, stratified, so there's two or more layers of cells, and columnar because there's columnar cells at the apical surface. Protects and secretes, and this is found in the large ducts of the salivary glands and some segments of the male urethra. And then there's transitional epithelium. So this is kind of a unique epithelium. It's stratified. It's limited to the urinary tract. And you'll see in a relaxed state, the basal cells are cuboidal or polyhedral, while the apical cells are large and rounded. And in a stretched state, these apical cells will become flattened, and this allows for stretching as the bladder fills. And I'll show you what I mean here. So this is the relaxed state of transitional epithelium. The apical cells are round, you can see. But if the bladder fills and stretches, then the apical cells become flattened, and this allows for the epithelium to stretch along with the bladder. So let's talk a minute about glands. Glands can be individual cells or multicellular organs. Glands are composed of epithelial tissue, and they secrete substances that are used elsewhere in the body or that go onward to be eliminated. There's two types of glands. There's endocrine and exocrine glands. So endocrine glands, these lack ducts. So they don't secrete their substances to the outside of the body. They secrete it to the inside. And what they secrete are hormones. And these go directly into the bloodstream. Then there's exocrine glands. And this is invaginated epithelium in connective tissue. And it's connected with the epithelial surface by a duct. So that's an epithelial lined tube through which secretions travel. And an example of exocrine glands would be sweat glands, mammary glands, and salivary glands. And you'll notice in all of these glands, the substances that are secreted make it to the outside of the body. Okay, so multicellular exocrine glands contain acini and ducts. Acini are the clusters of cells that actually produce the secretion, and the duct transports the secretion to the epithelial surface. And you can see this here. Here's an acinus. That's the singular of acini. This is the area of the gland that actually produces the secretion, and then the secretion travels through the duct to the outside of the body. We classify multicellular exocrine glands by their method of secretion. So you have merocrine glands, apocrine glands, and holocrine glands. So in merocrine glands, these package secretions into vesicles and then release those vesicles into the duct by exocytosis. Okay, so the example given here are the tear glands and the salivary glands. Apocrine glands, on the other hand, the apical membrane of the cells pinches off and becomes the secretion. So examples of apocrine glands would be mammary glands and ceruminous glands in the ear. Finally, you have holocrine glands, right? So these are formed from cells that just totally disintegrate and become the secretion. So there's a viscous mixture of cell fragments and cell product in the ducts that travels to the outside of the body, and these would be primarily your oil-producing glands in the skin, which are called sebaceous glands. And to show you what that looks like, here you have a merocrine gland, and you have the cells in the acinus here, which produce the secretion. And what's happening is these cells are producing vesicles that get secreted into the duct, and those vesicles go on, and they are the product of the gland. This is opposed to an apocrine gland, which you can see here. The apical portion of the cells is pinching off, and that whole piece becomes the secretion of the gland. And then holocrine glands, where the actual cells themselves disintegrate and become the product. Okay, moving on to connective tissue. This is a graphic representing the potential cells and fibers you can see in connective tissue. So connective tissue is composed of a ground substance, fibers, and cells, okay? So the ground substance is primarily water and protein, and it's kind of the stuff that all this other stuff resides in. You can have protein fibers in connective tissue. You can have elastic fiber, collagen fiber, and or reticular fibers. And then connective tissue has resident cells. So you might see mesenchymal cells. You might see a macrophage or two. If you're in adipose tissue, you'd see a bunch of adipocytes, because that's connective tissue. And you might see fibroblasts as well. So I found this chart useful for keeping the different connective tissues separate in my mind, and I hope it's useful to you too. You'll see that we have 3 different categories of connective tissue, and they all come from a common origin, the mesenchyme. The first connective tissue is connective tissue proper. This is going to be your loose connective tissue and your dense connective tissue. So loose connective tissue more cushions and supports. Okay, so it's going to cushion and support, say, your organs. Whereas dense connective tissue, this is going to be what binds things. Okay, so for example, dense regular connective tissue, this is going to be your tendons and ligaments. Dense irregular connective tissue is going to be like the reticular layer of the dermis, which basically holds your skin to the the rest of your body. The periosteum is just connective tissue around your bone, connective tissue sheaths around muscles and nerves. So you'll see these are binding connective tissues. And then you've got elastic connective tissue, and this is going to be in your skin, your outer ear, and the walls of large arteries, as well as ligaments and tendons. Okay, and then going back up here, you've got your second classification of connective tissue. You've got the supporting connective tissue. So this is going to be cartilage and bone. So in cartilage, you have a semi-solid extracellular matrix, and in bone, you have a solid matrix. And one thing I want to point out is that you have elastic cartilage, but you also have elastic dense connective tissue, right? So the way to keep these separate is in elastic dense connective tissue, you're going to see the cells are fibroblasts, whereas in elastic cartilage, the cells are going to be chondrocytes. Okay, and elastic cartilage makes up, it gives your body parts structure. For example, flexible support to the outer ear, the nose, and the epiglottis. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about fluid connective tissue, and this is going to be your blood and your lymph. Functions of connective tissue. So number one, physical protection. So the bones of your skull and thoracic cage protect organs. Adipose tissue also protects the kidneys and eyes. Number two, support and structural framework. So the bones of the body give the body structure and a framework and a place for muscle attachment. Cartilage helps keep the trachea and the bronchi open. Number three, connective tissue binds structures. So ligaments bind bone to bone, tendons bind muscle to bone, and dense irregular tissue anchors the skin to muscle and bone. Number four, storage. Adipose connective tissue is the major energy reserve of the body. And bone is also a storage site, primarily for calcium and phosphorus. Number five, transport. Blood is a connective tissue, and it carries nutrients, gases, and waste between regions of the body. And number six, immune protection. Connective tissue contains leukocytes, which are white blood cells that protect your body against disease. The extracellular matrix also restricts movement of pathogens as well, so it forms kind of a barrier. So let's talk about connective tissue proper, right? So there's loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. We're going to talk about loose connective tissue first. So in loose connective tissue, there are fewer cells and protein fibers than in dense connective tissue. The protein fibers are sparse, and they're arranged irregularly. There's a lot of ground substance. And loose connective tissue is kind of like the body's packing material. It supports structures, okay? There's three types of loose connective tissue to be aware of. There's areolar, there's adipose, and there's reticular connective tissue. So here's an example of what areolar connective tissue looks like. And you can see that its function is that it protects tissues and organs. It binds skin and some epithelia to deeper tissue. Then you have adipose connective tissue, and you can see the adipocytes here, large white globules. Its function is to store energy. It also insulates, cushions, and protects your body. Then you have reticular connective tissue, and this is really only found in the spleen, lymph nodes, and in the red bone marrow. And its function is it provides stroma, or a supportive framework, to lymphatic organs. Next, in connective tissue proper, you have dense connective tissue. And you're going to see this is mostly protein fibers, much less ground substance than in loose connective tissue. And you're going to see a lot of collagen fibers in dense connective tissue. There's three types. There's dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. So here's dense regular. You can see the protein fibers are all aligned kind of in the same direction. And its function, this is going to be your binding connective tissue, okay? So it attaches bone to bone, as well as muscle to bone, right? So that'd be ligaments is bone to bone and tendon is muscle to bone. And it resists stress applied in one direction. Whereas your dense irregular connective tissue, you can see the protein fibers, the collagen fibers are kind of all arranged in different directions. And this is to withstand stress applied in all directions. So dense irregular connective tissue is very durable. Then you have elastic connective tissue, and you can see the elastic fibers here. They stain black, so they're really easy to spot on histology. And elastic connective tissue allows for stretching and recoil. Okay, so supporting connective tissue, like the name suggests, provides support and protection to soft tissues and organs. We mentioned there's two types. There's cartilage and there's bone. So the first type we'll talk about is cartilage. This has an extracellular matrix that is firm and semi-solid. Cartilage has a lot of collagen and elastic protein fibers, and its resident cells are chondrocytes, which are mature cells that produce collagen and the extracellular matrix. And they occupy small spaces called lacunae. Cartilage is more flexible than bone, and there are three types to be familiar with: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. So here we have hyaline cartilage. You can see the chondrocytes here, and they take up a little area called a lacuna. This area surrounding the chondrocyte. And hyaline cartilage provides support and forms most of the fetal skeleton. Next you have fibrocartilage, and you can see the picture here shows it in the intervertebral disc. You have a lot of collagen fibers, and then you have the chondrocyte in its lacuna, and then ground substance in between the collagen fibers. And the function of fibrocartilage is to resist compression. It acts as a shock absorber. So you'll see this is very important in the spine. Finally, you have elastic cartilage. You can see here the elastic fibers and some ground substance. And its function is to maintain shape while permitting extensive flexibility. And you'll see elastic cartilage in the earlobe. The next supporting connective tissue is bone, and bone is obviously more solid than cartilage. The functions of bone are levers for movement, protection, storage, and the site of hematopoietic stem cells, so the site of blood cell production. The extracellular matrix in bone is composed of collagen and glycoproteins along with calcium phosphate, right? That gives it its hardness. The bone cells are called osteocytes, and again, these are housed within spaces called lacunae. And the osteocytes are mechanoreceptors that orchestrate bone remodeling by signaling to osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So osteoblasts build up bone, and osteoclasts break down bone. And the osteocytes themselves basically signal to these two types of cells saying, hey, we need more bone growth in this area, or hey, we need to break down a little bit of bone in this area. There's two types of bone. There's compact bone and there's spongy bone. So compact bone appears solid, but it is perforated by neurovascular canals, and it's formed from cylindrical structures called osteons. These display concentric rings of bone connective tissue called lamellae, and I'll show you what all of this means in a minute. And lamellae encircle the central or Haversian canal, which is the location of blood vessels and nerves. So here's what bone looks like under a microscope. And you can see it's made up of these cylindrical structures called osteons. And in the osteon are the osteocytes, right here. These purple-looking cells. And in the middle of the osteon is a canal that relays nerves and blood vessels. You can see it kind of looks like rings around a tree, right? So you have your central canal, and then you have these concentric rings encircling it, and those are the lamellae. Going back to the types of bone, you have spongy bone after compact bone. So spongy bone is also called trabecular bone and cancellous bone. And this is located on the inside of the bone. It's a latticework structure, and it's strong and lightweight. So here you can see the gross anatomy of a bone. On the outside you have compact bone, and then on the inside you have spongy bone or trabecular bone. Here is spongy bone under a microscope. So these pink areas, this is actually the bone, and these kind of white speckled areas are the area where the bone marrow is. So if we look at it at 400 times magnification, you can see here's the red bone marrow, and then the pink area is the actual trabecular bone. And you can see an osteocyte here inside of its lacuna. Okay, next is fluid connective tissue, and this is going to include our blood and lymph. So let's talk about blood, okay? So blood functions to transport respiratory gases. It functions in immune protection, and it also helps with blood clotting. So it's composed of formed elements and a liquid ground substance, which is called plasma. So the formed elements are erythrocytes, which are your red blood cells, and these transport respiratory gases. Then your leukocytes, which are the white blood cells, and these protect against infectious agents, right? And then finally you have your platelets, which are cellular fragments that help to clot the blood. We mentioned that the liquid ground substance is called plasma, and it dissolves proteins. And many of these proteins transport nutrients, wastes, and the plasma also helps to transport wastes, nutrients, and hormones as well. So here you can see blood under a microscopic slide. The red oval cells here are the red blood cells. Then you've got these large purple looking cells, and these are going to be your white blood cells. Okay, and then you've got these tiny little purple kind of fragments here, and those are your platelets. And I want you to be able to distinguish a red blood cell from a white blood cell from a platelet. All right. All right, next let's talk a little bit about muscle tissue. So these are cells that contract when they're stimulated, and contraction causes movement. So you can have voluntary motion of body parts, contraction of the heart, or propulsion of material through digestive and urinary tracts. And it turns out that there's a different type of muscle tissue for every one of these functions. And here's the three types. One is skeletal muscle, so that's going to be in charge of the voluntary motion of your body parts. The second type is cardiac muscle, and that's responsible for the contraction of the heart. And the third is smooth muscle, and that's going to be the muscles in your digestive tract that move food contents through. All right, and let's see what these look like underneath the microscope. So starting with skeletal muscle tissue, you can see skeletal muscle has long cylindrical cells. So this whole long cylindrical fiber is a single muscle cell. And you can also see associated with it multiple nuclei. So skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. They also have these lines in them called striations, And you'll see later in the muscle chapter that this is where the individual protein fibers in the muscle line up and help it to contract. The function of skeletal muscle tissue is responsible for moving the skeleton and for thermoregulation, so it helps to increase the body temperature when muscles contract. Remember, from our negative feedback loop example, skeletal muscle will contract to cause shivering to help increase body temperature. Next, we have cardiac muscle tissue. So this is going to be the muscle tissue of the heart that pumps blood through the body. You can see these are shorter cells, okay? Much shorter than the skeletal muscle fibers, and I'm trying to find a good example here, but they can branch. And they have these things called intercalated discs. And usually there's 1 or 2 nuclei in each cell. So a little bit different than a skeletal muscle's appearance. And you can also see very fine lines here. These are also striated muscle cells. So the 2 types of striated muscles are going to be your skeletal muscle and your cardiac muscle. Finally, you have smooth muscle, and you'll notice right away there are no striations on smooth muscle tissue. And these are like shorter tapered cells, and they have 1 nucleus in them. And their function is to move and propel materials through internal organs, and they help control the size of the lumen of those organs. For example, the lumen or the opening of your blood vessels is controlled by the smooth muscle to some extent, and the lumen of your gut, for example, your small intestine, is controlled by smooth muscle. Okay, and finally we have nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is located in the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves, and you'll find 2 types of cells in nervous tissue. You'll find neurons, which receive, transmit, and process the nerve impulses. And then you'll find glial cells. Now, glial cells don't transmit anything, but they are responsible for protecting and nourishing and supporting the neurons themselves. The anatomy of a neuron. So a neuron has a cell body, and this is going to house the nucleus and the other organelles. A neuron also has these processes called dendrites that are short branching extensions that come off of the cell body, and these guys receive incoming signals and transmit that information. And then you have the axon, which is the single long process that extends from the cell body and helps to transmit nerve impulses. So it carries outgoing signals to other cells. Neurons are the longest cells in the body. Okay, so let's look at a neuron here. This region here is the cell body, so you can see it houses the nucleus and the organelles. Then you have these branching processes coming off of the cell body. These are the dendrites that receive incoming signals. Then you have this long myelinated region of the neuron. This is the axon, and it ends in nerve terminals here. And so this essentially is the receiving end, and this is the transmitting end of the neuron. So the neuron will receive signals to the dendrite, process them, and then send an impulse based on those signals down its axon, and this axon will interact with dendrites of another neuron, or it might interact with muscle cells or a gland, something like that. You can see this in under the microscope. You can see the cell body. You can see the nucleus of the cell. You can also see the axon extending off the cell body. And here are the dendrites coming off of the cell body. And over here you can see a nucleus of a different cell, the glial cell. And we said the function of nervous tissue is neurons receive, process, and transmit nerve impulses, whereas glial cells help protect, nourish, and support neurons. Okay, let's take it a step further and talk about organs a little bit, because we said organs contain 2 or more tissue types, right? So these tissue types have to work together to perform specific complex function of the organ. They have to work in concert. And the example we'll use is the stomach, which contains all 4 tissue types. So here you can see the stomach, and if we took a section out of that stomach and looked at it closely, we would see all of these structures here. So starting from the inside of the stomach out, you would see a lining of epithelium. And underneath that, a large region of connective tissue with its blood vessels and with nervous tissue in there, right? It helps control the blood vessels. Next, the stomach has 3 layers of muscle. So there's the oblique layer, the circular layer, and the longitudinal layer. And then on the very outside, you'll see the mesothelium, which lines organs. So there's all 4 tissue types there. If you looked closer at the mucosa of the stomach, you would see the epithelial cells, and you would see that they form gastric glands. Okay, body membranes. So what is a membrane? Well, a membrane is formed from an epithelial layer and a connective tissue layer. Membranes line body cavities, cover the organs, and cover the body's external surface. And there's 4 types of membranes to be aware of. The first is mucous membrane, second is serous, third is cutaneous, and fourth is synovial. So the first body membrane is the mucous membrane. You'll also see this referred to as the mucosa, like we just did in the stomach example. And mucous membranes line passageways that are open to the external environment. This is going to include your digestive system, your respiratory tract, your urinary tract, and your reproductive tracts. Mucosa function in absorptive, protective, and secretory functions. And as we said, they're formed from epithelium and an underlying connective tissue. So here you can see a mucous membrane. This is the exterior area. And then this is going to be your epithelium. And then underneath it, the connective tissue. Serous membranes, we've already talked a little bit about. These line body cavities that do not open to external environment. For example, your thoracic cavity or your abdominal pelvic cavity. The serous membrane is a membrane composed of simple squamous epithelium, and this is referred to as the mesothelium. And it produces a thin, watery serous fluid, which reduces friction between opposing surfaces, right? We said that was the whole purpose of serous fluid. It forms 2 layers. There's the parietal layer, which lines the inside of the body cavity, and the visceral layer, which covers the surface of the organs. There's a potential space in between those 2 layers called the serous cavity, and that's where the serous fluid is produced and helps to reduce friction. Then there's the cutaneous membrane, right? And this is also called the skin. This covers the external surface of the body and is composed of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium, which we also call the epidermis, and underlying connective tissue, which we also call the dermis. And you can see that here. Here's the epithelium. You can see how it gets keratinized as it gets further away from the basal area of the epithelium. And then you have the underlying connective tissue. So epithelium is going to be the epidermis, and the underlying connective tissue is the dermis. And the function of the cutaneous membrane is to protect internal organs and prevent water loss. Next, you have the synovial membrane. This will line some of the joints in the body. It's composed of areolar connective tissue and squamous epithelial cells. Synovial fluid is secreted by those epithelial cells, and this helps reduce friction between the moving bones, and it distributes nutrients to cartilage because cartilage naturally lacks blood vessels, or it is avascular. And here, just for your review, each type of body membrane, I would be familiar with the differences in these and their functions for sure. All right, let's talk just a little bit about embryology and tissue development. So recall that the normal human body cell has 46 chromosomes, right? Whereas the normal human sex cell only has 23 chromosomes. And that's because the sex cells, the oocyte or the egg, and the sperm join together, and when they fuse together, they combine their chromosomes, so 23 here and 23 here, to produce 46 chromosomes. And then that structure is called a zygote at that time, okay? So you have a haploid cell, which is an oocyte, join with another haploid cell, the sperm, and this forms a diploid cell, the zygote, which has 46 chromosomes. The zygote then goes on to perform multiple cell divisions, and at one stage it becomes a blastocyst. And I'll show you pictures of this in a second. The blastocyst has an area of cells that will go on to form the embryo, and that's called the embryoblast. And this occurs at about 2 to 3 weeks after conception. Then there's 3 primary germ layers that form around the 4th week. The germ layers are the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm, and these germ layers will go on to form the tissues and the organs of the body. Once you have all 3 primary germ layers, the growing structure is now called an embryo. Okay, so let's look at the stages of early human embryonic development. So you start off with the fertilized egg. So this is going to be called a zygote. And the zygote goes on to multiple cellular divisions until it forms a solid ball of cells, in which case it's called a morula. The morula goes on to divide more and more, and it hollows out. And now you have a hollow ball of cells, and this is called the blastocyst. And I think I have a better picture of the blastocyst here. You can see this ball of cells in the blastocyst is the embryoblast, and this is going to go on to develop into the embryo. The blastocyst begins to invaginate, and this is called gastrulation, and this is what's going to create the germ cell layers. And this continues until you've got what's termed a gastrula. And you'll see this region here is going to become the endoderm. This region outside is going to be the ectoderm, and the middle region is going to become the mesoderm. And when all of those germ layers form, like right here, it's termed an embryo. And you can see them all very well on this image right here. Okay, and this is another image of that gastrula stage. So you see the inside portion here becomes the endoderm. And the endoderm forms the endocrine glands, the lungs, the digestive tract, and the liver, among other things. This middle portion becomes the mesoderm, and the mesoderm produces the muscle, the skeleton, the kidneys, and the reproductive system. And then the outer portion here, termed the ectoderm, becomes your nervous system and your skin. All right, so let's talk about the ectoderm first. We mentioned that it's initially located on the outside of that embryo, the forming embryo. It's responsible for forming many external structures such as the epidermis of the skin, your hair, your nails, and exocrine glands. Some, but not all, epithelial tissues are derived from the ectoderm, And then some other structures derived include tooth enamel, the lens of the eye, your adrenal medulla, which is actually derived from early nervous tissue, and then all nervous tissue comes from the ectoderm, and that's very important to remember. Okay, so when I said some but not all epithelial tissues are formed from the ectoderm, remember that the ectoderm epithelium stops at the anus and mouth. So in there it fuses directly to the endoderm. So it really only covers part of the anus and the mouth. Next is the mesoderm. This is the middle primary germ layer. This is going to form all muscle tissue. And it's going to form the epithelial lining of vessels and serous membranes, so the epithelia inside the body. Becomes mesenchyme, which also becomes all the connective tissue in the body. So the mesoderm gives rise to all muscle tissue and all connective tissue in the body. Other mesoderm-derived structures would be the dermis. That makes sense, right? Because that's composed of connective tissue. The heart, the kidneys and ureters, and the internal reproductive structures. So the mesoderm gives rise to blood vessels and blood cells, gives rise to all the muscle in the body, and it also gives rise to all the connective tissue in the body. And finally, you have the endoderm, and this is the innermost germ layer. And you're going to get the epithelial linings of most of your body. So the digestive tract, the respiratory tract, and the genital urinary tract. You're also going to have the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, and the thymus derived from the endoderm, as well as most of the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. And the lungs also come from the endoderm. So important takeaway for the endoderm, you're going to have most of the lining of the digestive tract and the digestive organs derived from the endoderm. You're going to have the lungs and most of the remaining endocrine glands derived from the endoderm. And of course, you're going to have all of those epithelial linings of your respiratory tract, your GI tract, your urinary tract, and your reproductive tract. All right, this picture is from your book. It's good for review, especially these boxes here that tell you the different structures that are derived from the different germ layers. And I would be familiar with these, especially the big takeaways. For example, the ectoderm, all nervous tissue comes from the ectoderm. All of your skin comes from the ectoderm. The endoderm, you're going to be thinking epithelial linings, okay? And the mesoderm, you should be thinking muscle and blood, okay? All right, let's just talk a minute about the different types of stem cells. So we categorize them based on whether they're embryonic in origin or if they're adult in origin. And then embryonic stem cells can go on to be either totipotent or pluripotent. So what do we mean when we say embryonic stem cells? Well, they originate from the dividing cells of the zygote or from the embryoblast portion, right here, of the blastocyst. So if they originate from the zygote, these would be totipotent stem cells. So totipotent stem cells are those cells formed from the zygote and can give rise to every differentiated cell in either the organism and the placenta, okay? So these can literally become any cell in the body or the placenta. Whereas pluripotent stem cells are derived from the embryoblast. So here in the blastocyst, you've already differentiated a little bit. You've differentiated into embryoblast cells. So these cells can go on to become any kind of cell in the forming embryo. So not the placenta. These can be any cells but the placenta, essentially. Then you get to adult stem cells. So adult stem cells are the undifferentiated stem cells in the body after birth. They can be multipotent or unipotent. So multipotent stem cells, the example given is in the bone marrow. These are capable of differentiating into a restricted number of some cell types and not others. So in the bone marrow, you could differentiate into red blood cells, white blood cells, or thrombocytes, okay? Unipotent stem cells, on the other hand, have the ability to differentiate only into a single type of cell. And an example given is the skin cells, which can only go on to divide and produce more skin cells. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what can happen to your tissues in response to differing stimuli. So you could have hypertrophy of a tissue, and that's going to be increase in size of existing cells in the tissue. That's opposed to hyperplasia, which is an increase in number of the cells of a tissue. You can have atrophy. This is shrinkage of tissue either by the decrease in cell number or decrease in cell size, and this is due to normal aging or to disuse. You can have dysplasia. This is an abnormal tissue development. Sometimes it's precancerous and sometimes it reverts back to normal. You can have necrosis. This is tissue death due to irreversible tissue damage. You can have metaplasia. This is the change of mature epithelium to a different form. So this can happen sometimes as an epithelium adapts to its environment. For example, in smokers. Smokers experience metaplastic changes in their tracheal epithelium. The normal epithelium there is pseudostratified ciliated columnar, but it changes to non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and this is in response to the toxins that are coming into contact with it, right? And so if the person quits smoking cigarettes, that non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium will revert back to pseudostratified ciliated columnar, back to its normal epithelium. You can have neoplasia. So this is tissue growth that is out of control, which creates a tumor, and a tumor of abnormal tissue can develop. It can be benign, where it's a localized growth, it does not spread, and the cells are more differentiated in benign tumors, meaning that the cells resemble the original tissue more. You can have malignant neoplasia. This type of neoplasia can metastasize, which means it spreads and invades other tissues, and we call this cancer. In cancer, cells are less differentiated, meaning that they tend not to resemble the original tissue from which the cancer is derived. And of course, cancer can interfere with normal functioning, leading to death. So here's an example of progression of squamous carcinoma. You can see the normal bronchial epithelium here. So normal cells, they're ciliated, they're pseudostratified, and they're in the right place. You can have squamous metaplasia, where you've got normal cells, right? So it's metaplasia, so it's gone from one normal epithelium to another normal epithelium. But these cells shouldn't be here. They're in the wrong place. You can have squamous carcinoma in situ next. This is where you develop abnormal cells in an abnormal arrangement. You can see very much different than the original bronchial epithelium here. And then it can progress to invasive squamous carcinoma, where you have very abnormal cells and you start to see areas of necrosis or cell death. That's what these clear areas are. Okay, the effects of aging on tissues. So all tissues change with aging. Proper nutrition, good health, normal circulation, infrequent wounds, all of this promotes normal functioning. Support maintenance and replacement of cells and extracellular matrix. This helps replenish your tissues, but this process becomes less efficient after about middle age. Really, after about 30, it starts declining. So structure and chemical composition of many of your tissues become altered. So the epithelial will thin, the connective tissue will lose its pliability and resiliency, collagen production declines, bones can become brittle, and muscles atrophy. And these are all just normal processes of aging. And this is just a summary chart of the 4 primary tissues. This is out of your book. I recommend looking over this and just making sure you know the composition, the functions, and have an idea of the subtypes of these different tissues.